Welcome back to our Lenten study on the Sermon on the Mount. We're now on week 6. This is Palm Sunday, and you can look for the first 5 sessions if you missed any of them on our YouTube channel, Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. Just search for that and you'll find us and find any of the first 5 sessions. Today we're finishing the Sermon on the Mount with Matthew chapter 7. We're looking at verses 13 through 29. We're looking at the road to life and following up with the sermon on acting out what Jesus actually taught us to do. So it's important to go ahead and follow through with actions on our beliefs. I'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition, and I encourage you to read along in whatever version you have that you find helpful. We'll start with verse 13 where Jesus says, "Enter through the narrow gate, for the gate is wide and the road is easy that leads to destruction, and there are many who take it. For the gate is narrow and the road is hard that leads to life, and there are few who find it." So I want us to notice that this comes right after the verse that has to do with the golden rule. And it means that we need to be intentional about looking at perspective from others' point of view, and that does not come necessarily naturally to us, and so that road may be narrow for us. And so Jesus is acknowledging that this is hard for us to do, and I would say all of the Beatitudes, as we look at those, would fit with this. And as we move with Jesus to the cross this week, what if you were more intentional about looking towards others and seeing it from their perspective? How might this be the road that leads to life? As we look at verse 15, Jesus says, "Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? In the same way, every good tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears bad fruit. A good tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit will be cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits." So this is interesting. We start off the chapter being told not to judge, and yet we're supposed to be aware of false prophets and bad fruit, and that would take some judgment on our behalf. So what is really going on here? We are supposed to determine between good and bad behavior, between teaching that leads us to life and that which leads us to destruction. And so we're not to adopt a judgmental attitude. Even the bad teachers, we're supposed to view with mercy, and we're not supposed to adopt an attitude where we're so much above them. So the Beatitudes reflected here in these passages, really, I would say, are all of them. The good fruit are those who would exemplify the Beatitudes at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. The bad fruit are those who ignore them to their own peril. In verse 21, Jesus says, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father in heaven. On that day, many will say to me, 'Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name and cast out demons in your name and do many mighty works in your name?' Then I will declare to them, 'I never knew you. Go away from me, you who behave lawlessly.'" And so, as we hear this portion of the sermon, we may be hearkening back to the part of the sermon where Jesus tells us not to worry, because this actually sounds pretty worrisome. How do we know if we're in the good graces of God? That's where we want to be. And so once again, this reminds us, I think, of all of the Beatitudes, but specifically, I would say, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." So we're not to worry so much as we are to be merciful. And that aligns with many of the teachings throughout the sermon. So what Jesus seems to be saying is if you can attempt to do all these good things, but if you are not merciful and doing some of these other things that I say, some of the good things that you're doing may not really matter. So it's important that we begin to exemplify the teachings that are being taught us. Verse 24 says, "Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, but it did not fall because it had been founded on rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rain fell and the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall." So we see here that Jesus does expect us to put his teachings into action. And what I like about this is that we can see that Jesus basically tells us tough times come to the faithful and the unfaithful alike. A lot of times we believe, or we have this sense of understanding, that if you're really faithful, you won't be touched by any kind of tragedy or hardship in life. And that's not true. To quote Bob Dylan, a hard rain's going to fall on really everybody. So what it's saying is those who incorporate these teachings in their lives may find that the tough times don't wash them away. Those who don't make this a part of their identities may find that hard occurrences in life may do them in. Verse 28 says, "Now when Jesus had finished saying these words, the crowds were astounded at his teaching, for he taught them as one having authority and not as their scribes." So this is the end of the sermon, and we see Jesus contrasted. Matthew contrasts Jesus with the scribes, who would have normally been seen as the kind of people who would be more faithful or more understanding of the Bible. But the contrast we see is that the scribes may not have been seen as showing the Beatitudes. They may not have had the humility or meekness that they should have. They may not have shown the mercy to others. They may not have been peacemakers. And so they may not have been seen as displaying righteousness as we understand it from a biblical lens, and that is being apparent to those on the outside looking in, as referenced from Job. And so Jesus is asking us to do better than the scribes, in essence. So I'd like to conclude our time with this prayer from Ignatius of Loyola. God, fill us with your light and life, that we may show forth your wondrous glory. Grant that your love may so fill our lives, that we may count nothing too small to do for you, nothing too much to give, and nothing too hard to bear. Amen. I appreciate you going with us through the Sermon on the Mount and through this teaching. And this being Holy Week, we have a lot of things going on this week. We would love to see you at any of these, and we'd hope to see you next week for Easter. We should be back on at 11 o'clock.